The disappearance of Margaret Hensley shook a small mining town to its core, leaving behind whispers that would echo through generations. After 4 decades of questions without answers, the truth finally emerges from the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. The forgotten mystery that haunted Virginia's coal country will soon reveal its darkest secrets. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The bitter winter of 1913 had wrapped Smoky Hollow in a punishing grip. Snow piled in drifts against the weathered clapboards of the Hensley farmhouse, and the wind howled through the bare apple trees like a woman's distant cry. It was on the coldest night of January when Margaret Hensley vanished without a trace, leaving behind 2 children and a husband whose eyes had long since turned to stone. The Charleston Gazette barely noted her disappearance, tucking the brief mention between reports of ongoing coal strikes and announcements for the Methodist Church social. "Local woman missing from Smoky Hollow home," read the small headline on page 7. By the following week, her name had dissolved into the indifference of a community, accustomed to hardship and trained not to pry into family matters. Samuel Hensley, Margaret's 8-year-old son, spent hours at the kitchen window, his small breath creating patches of fog on the glass as he stared at the snow-covered orchard. His mother had promised to teach him grafting in the spring. Now he watched the trees, standing like silent sentinels, wondering if they knew where she had gone. "Samuel, get away from that window," Caleb would bark whenever he caught the boy looking out. The farmer's voice had grown harsher since his wife's disappearance, his movements more deliberate, his silences longer and heavier. In the corner of the front room, 5-year-old Clara sat with a small stick, tracing shapes in the frost that formed on the inside of the window panes. "That's Mama sleeping," she would say, pointing to crude lines that resembled a woman lying down. No one understood what she meant. When neighbors asked, she would only repeat the phrase, her small face solemn beneath her woolen cap. She ran off, Caleb told anyone who dared ask. Couldn't handle the winter, couldn't handle the children. His stony stare discouraged further questions, and most folks nodded, accepting his explanation despite the inconsistencies. Margaret had left without taking a single possession, not her coat, not her mother's brooch, not even the photograph of her children she kept by her bedside. Eleanor Grant, Margaret's sister, was the only one who wrote letters demanding answers. Margaret would never abandon her children, she insisted from her home in Morgantown. But distance and the slow pace of rural mail made her protests easy to ignore. At night, Samuel would hear his father pacing, heavy boots crossing the wooden floors long after darkness had fallen. Sometimes he would slip from the house, lantern in hand, returning hours later with mud on his boots despite the frozen ground. Samuel never asked where he went. Some questions were safer left unasked in the Hensley home, where silence had become as thick as the fog that clung to Smoky Hollow like a shroud. The Hensley farmhouse stood like a sentinel on the hillside, its weathered clapboards barely visible for the persistent mist that clung to Smoky Hollow. Inside those walls, time moved with mechanical precision. Each hour marked not by laughter or conversation, but by the heavy footfalls of Caleb Hensley as he moved from room to room, inspecting, correcting, controlling. "Samuel, those firewood stacks are crooked. Do them again," he would command, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The boy would nod, wordlessly rearranging the logs, while his father's cold gaze bore into his back. At 9 years old, Samuel had already mastered the art of invisibility, moving through the house with practiced quietness to avoid his father's notice. In the kitchen, Clara's small hands struggled with the heavy iron skillet, attempting to prepare meals as she'd seen her mother do. When she spilled flour or broke eggs, Caleb would stare at her with such disappointment that the child would tremble. "Your mother would have done better," he would mutter, though he never spoke Margaret's name directly. At church on Sundays, the family arrived precisely at 9:45, sitting in the third pew from the front. The congregation's eyes followed them, particularly the women who exchanged knowing glances when Clara appeared in dresses slightly too small or with her hair imperfectly braided. "Poor motherless children," they whispered behind hymn books. "Some women just aren't cut out for farm life," others would add, repeating Caleb's carefully crafted narrative that Margaret had abandoned them for city comforts. Mrs. Whitaker, after Sunday service, once approached Caleb with an offer to help with the children. "I could come by after school hours," the teacher suggested, her voice gentle but her eyes searching his face. Caleb declined with a tight smile that never reached his eyes. "We manage just fine," he responded, his hand gripping Samuel's shoulder so firmly the boy winced. The farm itself continued to function. Cows were milked, fields were tended, vegetables harvested. From the outside, life appeared to move forward. Yet an unnatural stillness had settled over the property, as if the very land held its breath. Even the chickens seemed to cluck more quietly in the yard. At night, when Caleb finally retired to the bedroom he had once shared with Margaret, Samuel would creep to Clara's room. The little girl would often be awake, staring at the ceiling. "Do you remember what Mama smelled like?" she once whispered. Samuel shook his head, though he did remember, like lavender and fresh bread. But speaking of such things felt dangerous, as if the walls themselves might report back to their father. The unease in the Hensley home was palpable, settling into corners and beneath floorboards, thick as the morning mist that shrouded the valley below, a mist that never fully lifted, not even on the brightest days. Clara Hensley sat cross-legged on the wooden floor of her bedroom, sheets of paper spread around her like fallen leaves. At 5 years old, she couldn't articulate the hollow feeling that had settled in her chest since her mother's disappearance, but her small fingers worked tirelessly with worn-down crayons, expressing what words could not. Day after day, the same images emerged from her hands. A woman lying beneath the sprawling apple tree from their orchard, dark smudges around her eyes, and always, in the corner of each drawing, a shovel. Sometimes the woman's dress was blue, like the one Margaret had worn on Sundays, and sometimes the tree had red dots that might have been apples or something else entirely. "What are you drawing, Clara?" Samuel asked one afternoon, kneeling beside his sister. At 10 years old, he carried a weight beyond his years, shoulders already hunched from farm work and worry. Clara didn't look up, her hand moving in determined strokes. "Mama sleeping," she whispered, adding more dark lines around the figure's eyes. Samuel felt his throat tighten. He glanced nervously toward the hallway, listening for their father's heavy footsteps. The boy was caught between protecting his sister and fearing what might happen if Caleb saw these drawings. He'd already noticed how their father's jaw clenched whenever Clara mentioned their mother. "Maybe we should draw something else," he suggested gently, pushing a blank sheet toward her. "How about the horses?" Clara shook her head stubbornly. "She's under the tree. I saw her." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Samuel quickly gathered some of the more disturbing sketches, shoving them under Clara's bed. But he wasn't fast enough. Caleb Hensley filled the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the children's artwork. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the scattered papers. Without a word, he crossed the room and picked up one of Clara's drawings. "What's this nonsense?" he demanded, his voice deceptively quiet. "Just pictures," Samuel answered quickly. "Clara's been drawing." "I wasn't asking you." Caleb's attention remained fixed on his daughter. "What is this?" Clara looked up at her father, her small face solemn. "It's Mama. She's sleeping under the apple tree." Something flickered across Caleb's face, fear perhaps, or rage, before he methodically gathered every drawing within reach. With deliberate movements, he tore each one into pieces, letting the fragments flutter to the floor like confetti. "Your mother's gone," he said flatly. "She left us. There'll be no more of this foolishness, you understand?" Clara's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stared at the torn pieces of her artwork as Caleb turned and left the room. That night, when the house grew quiet, Samuel found his sister with a new sheet of paper, drawing the same scene again. The crisp February wind whipped across the fields as Eleanor Grant stepped off the train in Smoky Hollow. 6 weeks without a letter from Margaret was unlike her sister, who wrote religiously every Sunday after church. Eleanor clutched her leather satchel tightly, anxiety gnawing at her stomach as she hired a local wagon to take her to the Hensley farm. The farmhouse stood like a gray specter against the winter sky, smoke trailing weakly from the chimney. Eleanor's knock was met with silence before Samuel opened the door, his young face a mask of practiced neutrality that broke her heart. "Aunt Eleanor," he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Caleb Hensley appeared in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the entrance. "Wasn't expecting visitors," he said, the words clipped and cold. "I've written 3 times with no response," Eleanor replied, meeting his gaze directly. "I needed to see my sister." The interior of the home struck Eleanor immediately. Margaret's touches were fading. The curtains hung unwashed, the floor needed sweeping, and the air carried a staleness that her sister would never have tolerated. "She left," Caleb stated flatly, watching Eleanor's face. "Packed a bag one night, didn't even say goodbye to the children." Little Clara sat in the corner, her small fingers working methodically at a piece of paper, not looking up. The child's hair was uncombed, her dress clean but wrinkled. "That's not possible," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Margaret would never leave her children." The farmer's jaw tightened. "Women do unexpected things, even ones you think you know." That night, Eleanor slept in Margaret's bed, searching for any clue her sister might have left behind. She found nothing but a hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. Over the next days, Eleanor ventured into town, asking careful questions. At the general store, conversations halted when she entered. The postmaster suddenly couldn't remember when he'd last seen Margaret. Mrs. Whitaker, the schoolteacher, glanced nervously at the door before admitting she'd found Samuel's behavior concerning lately. "Folks mind their business in Smoky Hollow," the shopkeeper finally told her. "Marriages have their troubles. Best not to interfere." But Eleanor noticed how the local women avoided her gaze, how they hustled their children past when she approached. Their silence spoke volumes. Each night, she documented her observations in a small notebook, hidden in her undergarments. She sketched the layout of the farm, noted Caleb's contradicting statements about when Margaret had supposedly left, and recorded Samuel's whispered comment, "Papa gets angry if we talk about Mama." Eleanor knew she couldn't return to Morgantown empty-handed. Something terrible had happened to her sister, and the mist-shrouded valley was determined to keep its secrets. The first thaw of spring brought a strange energy to the Hensley farm. As the frost retreated from the soil, Caleb Hensley announced his plans to dig a new cellar beneath the eastern side of the farmhouse. To the neighbors who inquired, he spoke of practical matters: better food preservation, additional storage for the coming harvest, protection from summer heat. "A man needs proper storage," he told Mr. Jenkins from the adjacent property, his voice carrying the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed his explanation. Margaret always complained about the potatoes sprouting too early. The mention of her missing wife silenced further questions. In Smoky Hollow, Margaret's name had already begun to fade, like morning mist under a strengthening sun. Samuel watched his father with wary eyes as they worked together, digging deeper into the West Virginia clay. At 12 years old, the boy's shoulders already carried the weight of unspoken burdens. He noticed things others might miss: how his father measured the space with unusual precision, how the walls were reinforced not just for stability, but for soundproofing. "Hand me those timber boards," Caleb instructed, wiping sweat from his brow. Samuel observed his father's hands trembling slightly as he hammered the heavy oak planks into place. These weren't the steady hands that had built fences and repaired barn doors. These were the hands of a man haunted. The cellar took shape over 3 weeks, a space 8 feet square, with walls reinforced by double-layered timber. Most telling was the door, thick oak with iron bands, secured by an imposing padlock that Caleb kept the key to on a chain around his neck. "No sense in having storage if vermin can get in," he explained to Eleanor when she questioned the excessive security. Margaret's sister merely nodded, adding this detail to her mental inventory of inconsistencies. 5-year-old Clara refused to go near the new structure. When Samuel found her hiding behind the woodpile one afternoon, she clutched her drawing pad to her chest. "What are you drawing, Clara?" he asked gently. The little girl hesitantly revealed her latest creation, crude charcoal lines depicting a dark room with no windows, black scribbles filling the space as if to suggest something hidden in shadows. "It's where the bad dreams live," she whispered. That night, Samuel heard his father in the cellar, working late. The sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor filtered up through the floorboards. When morning came, Caleb emerged exhausted, dirt caked under his fingernails despite there being no garden work to be done. The cellar was completed by month's end, standing as a silent sentinel of secrets beneath their feet. More prison than pantry, more vault than vegetable store. Samuel Hensley lingered after the school bell rang, his small fingers tracing patterns on his wooden desk. The other children had already rushed outside, eager for their afternoon freedom. But Samuel remained, gathering the courage he'd been building all day. Mrs. Whitaker noticed him as she erased the arithmetic lesson from the blackboard. "Is everything all right, Samuel?" she asked, setting down her eraser and approaching his desk. The boy glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone. "She's still digging," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the empty classroom. The teacher knelt beside him, her brow furrowed with concern. "Who's digging, Samuel?" "Clara. She keeps drawing pictures of Mama under the ground." His eyes welled with tears. "And Father gets so angry when he sees them." Mrs. Whitaker placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The rumors about Margaret Hensley's disappearance had circulated through Smoky Hollow for months now. Most dismissed it as a woman abandoning her family. But the teacher had noticed the change in both Hensley children, Samuel's withdrawal and Clara's disturbing artwork. "Has your Aunt Eleanor seen these drawings?" she asked carefully. Samuel shook his head. "Father hides them. He burned some in the stove last night." That evening, Mrs. Whitaker penned a careful note addressed to Eleanor Grant, detailing Samuel's concerns and Clara's drawings. She sealed it in an envelope and gave it to Tommy Jenkins, whose family's farm bordered the Hensley property, instructing him to deliver it directly to Eleanor. But Tommy, intimidated by Caleb Hensley's stern reputation, hesitated at the edge of the property. When Caleb emerged from the barn, Tommy panicked and stuffed the note into his pocket, mumbling something about looking for a stray dog before hurrying away. The note never reached Eleanor. Instead, it was forgotten in Tommy's jacket, later destroyed when his mother washed his clothes. At the Sunday service, Mrs. Whitaker attempted to approach Eleanor directly, but Caleb kept his family close, his watchful eyes never leaving them. The teacher caught Sheriff Miller after the service, mentioning her concerns in hushed tones. "Now, Evelyn," the sheriff said with a patronizing smile, "we don't go poking into family matters without cause. Caleb's having a hard enough time raising those children alone." The community of Smoky Hollow had long operated on an unspoken rule. Family business remained private. Neighbors might gossip, but they rarely intervened. Even when Widow Parker mentioned seeing Caleb digging behind the orchard late at night, the information was shared as curiosity, not concern. Whitaker's worry gradually faded beneath the weight of daily responsibilities. Samuel stopped bringing up his sister's drawings, and the teacher convinced herself that perhaps she had overreacted. The hollow's fog seemed to swallow Samuel's warning, just as it had enveloped the truth about his mother. Mrs. Abernathy pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she approached the Hensley farmhouse. The mist clung to the valley that morning, making the isolated property seem even more removed from the rest of Smoky Hollow. As the most experienced midwife in the county, Martha Abernathy had visited countless homes over her 30 years of practice, but something about this particular visit left her deeply unsettled. Eleanor Grant sat across from the midwife in the small tier room adjacent to the general store, listening intently as the older woman recounted her experience. "Margaret wasn't herself," Mrs. Abernathy whispered, her weathered hands trembling slightly around her teacup. "She'd sent for me about her monthly troubles, but when I arrived, she seemed afraid to speak freely." The midwife described how Caleb Hensley had hovered throughout her visit, ostensibly tending to tasks in adjacent rooms, but always within earshot. "I've never seen a man so interested in women's matters," she confided. "Every time I asked your sister a direct question, his footsteps would pause, like he was listening." What troubled Martha most was Margaret's behavior when Caleb briefly went to the barn. "She grabbed my wrist so tight it left marks," the midwife said, pushing up her sleeve to reveal the faded yellowish bruises. "She begged me not to return, said she'd manage on her own." Her eyes, they were like a trapped animal's. Eleanor made careful notes in her small leather notebook. "Did you tell the sheriff about this?" she asked. Mrs. Abernathy's bitter laugh echoed in the nearly empty tea room. "Sheriff Dawson patted my hand like I was a child with nightmares, said it was just women's nerves and that Margaret had always been delicate. Told me not to spread gossip that might harm a respectable family." The midwife leaned forward, her voice dropping further. "But I know what I saw. The children, especially little Clara, they watched their father like they were measuring his moods. And Samuel, poor boy, he tried to speak to me alone, but Caleb called him away sharply." As they parted ways, Martha pressed a folded paper into Eleanor's hand. "I wrote down everything I observed, dates, times, exactly what was said. Someone should know." Eleanor tucked the document into her growing collection of testimonies and observations. That evening, she carefully organized her dossier, adding Mrs. Abernathy's account to the mounting evidence that Margaret's disappearance was far more sinister than a wife abandoning her family. "I won't let them forget you," she whispered to her sister's photograph. The face that looked back at her, eyes wary even in a posed portrait, seemed to acknowledge the promise. Eleanor closed the file, more determined than ever to uncover the truth that Smoky Hollow seemed so intent on burying. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Caleb Hensley read it with a stony expression before announcing they would leave Smoky Hollow within the week. No explanation was offered, just orders barked at Samuel to begin packing their belongings while Clara watched from the staircase, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. "What about school?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "School can wait," his father snapped, folding the telegram into his pocket. "We've got family business in Ohio." The farm sold for less than half its worth to the Millers from 2 valleys over. Neighbors whispered about the hasty departure, their theories ranging from unpaid debts to Caleb's growing paranoia. Mrs. Whitaker stopped by with a basket of preserves, her eyes searching the house for signs of the children. "Such a shame you're leaving," she said, gaze lingering on the padlocked cellar door. Caleb merely nodded, his fingers drumming impatiently against the doorframe until she departed. They settled in a small clapboard house outside Columbus, far from the mountains that had witnessed their secrets. The city's growing industries offered anonymity. No one asked about Margaret, and Caleb introduced himself as a widower, a story Samuel and Clara were instructed to confirm. Clara, now 10, refused to enter the basement of their new home. The first time Caleb ordered her to fetch preserves, she froze at the top of the stairs, her body trembling uncontrollably. "It's just like home," she whispered, eyes wide with terror. "The dark keeps secrets," Samuel intervened, offering to go instead. That night, he found his sister hunched over her sketchbook by candlelight, her small hands working frantically across the page. The drawings had evolved from childish scribbles to something more deliberate. Locked doors, shadowy figures with outstretched hands, and a woman's face peering through floorboards. "You shouldn't draw those things," Samuel warned, glancing nervously toward their father's room. Clara didn't look up. "I can't stop seeing them when I close my eyes." In the following weeks, she developed rituals, checking under beds, refusing to sleep with her back to open doors, keeping her sketchbook hidden beneath a loose floorboard. At school, her teacher noted her jumpiness in a letter home, suggesting a doctor's visit. Caleb burned the letter without comment. The farmhouse in Smoky Hollow faded into memory for most, but for Clara, it lived in every shadow, every closed door, every basement stair. Her drawings became her testimony, the only language she had for the horrors she couldn't fully remember, but would never truly forget. Eleanor Grant refused to let her sister's memory fade into obscurity. While the Hensley family had disappeared into the anonymity of Ohio, Eleanor remained in West Virginia, haunted by the conviction that Margaret hadn't simply abandoned her children. The absence of a body or concrete evidence didn't deter her. It only strengthened her resolve. In her modest Morgantown home, Eleanor meticulously assembled what she called her truth box. Inside, she preserved every scrap of information related to Margaret's disappearance. Yellowed newspaper clippings from the Charleston Gazette, statements from neighbors who'd noticed Margaret's increasing isolation in the months before she vanished, and photographs showing her sister's gradual transformation from a vibrant young woman to someone whose eyes held unmistakable fear. "Your aunt wouldn't just leave," Eleanor told her niece Catherine during one of their Sunday visits. "Something happened in that house, something Caleb doesn't want anyone to know." Eleanor wrote countless letters, to the county sheriff, to lawyers in Charleston, even to a detective she'd read about in the newspaper. Most went unanswered. Those who did respond offered the same frustrating response. Without evidence of foul play, there was nothing to investigate. "Mrs. Grant," the sheriff finally told her after her third visit to his office, "sometimes women just leave. It's unfortunate, but it happens." The community of Smoky Hollow grew weary of Eleanor's questions. At the general store, conversations would halt when she entered. After church services, people would hurry to their automobiles to avoid her inquiries. She became known as that Grant woman, the troublemaker who couldn't let sleeping dogs lie. "She's stirring up gossip about decent folk," Reverend Paulson remarked to his wife. "The Hensleys have suffered enough without her accusations." But Eleanor persisted. She interviewed the midwife again, documented the sudden construction of the cellar, and noted the children's unusual behaviors. Each piece of information was carefully labeled and dated, creating a timeline that pointed to something far more sinister than abandonment. When Eleanor passed away in 1936, her dossier might have been lost forever. Instead, Catherine preserved the collection, adding her own notes over the years. The box moved from attic to attic, its contents yellowing but intact, until 1954, when Catherine read about Ruth Simmons purchasing the old Hensley property. "I have something you should see," Catherine wrote to Ruth. "My Aunt Eleanor spent years documenting what happened to Margaret Hensley. Perhaps together we can finally uncover the truth." The dossier, passed from one determined woman to another, would become the foundation for justice that was decades overdue. Samuel Hensley grew into his teenage years with stooped shoulders, as if the weight of what happened in that farmhouse had physically pressed down on him. At 17, he would stare at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of their Columbus home, searching for traces of his mother in his own features, wondering if she would recognize the man he was becoming. His silence had calcified into something hard and impenetrable. Samuel believed this fortress of quiet protected Clara from their father's unpredictable rage. Whenever Caleb's voice rose, Samuel would position himself between them, drawing the man's attention away from his sister with a well-timed question about the automobile or the farm equipment they'd brought from West Virginia. "You think you're clever," Caleb once muttered, catching Samuel's strategy. Your mother thought she was clever too. Those rare mentions of Margaret sent ice through Samuel's veins. He learned to navigate his father's moods like treacherous waters, anticipating the currents, steering Clara to safety. What he couldn't see was how his sister absorbed everything anyway, how the trauma burrowed deep within her, manifesting in her art and her fears. After high school, Samuel found work at a manufacturing plant, saving every dollar until he could afford his own apartment across town. He visited Clara regularly, but refused to sleep under his father's roof again. When asked about his hometown, Samuel would simply say, "Ohio is home now," and change the subject. He destroyed letters from distant relatives in Smoky Hollow. When Eleanor attempted contact, Samuel returned her envelopes unopened. The past was a locked door, and he had thrown away the key. Only with Clara did the facade occasionally crack. During their infrequent conversations about their mother, his voice would drop to a whisper, eyes darting toward windows and doors, as if Caleb might materialize from the shadows. "Do you remember the orchard?" Clara asked him once, when she was 16. "Don't," Samuel replied, the single word carrying years of warning. "I still dream about the cellar," she confessed, clutching her sketchbook. Samuel's hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. "Some things should stay buried, Clara." What Samuel never understood was that his silence, intended as protection, had instead preserved the trauma like an insect in amber. While he believed he was shielding his sister from their father's wrath, he was actually helping maintain the very silence that had allowed their mother's fate to remain hidden for so long. As he entered his 30s, Samuel married and had children of his own. But he remained vigilant, watching his wife for signs of fear, inspecting his home for hiding places. The past never released him, even as he refused to acknowledge its hold. The year was 1952, and Clara Hensley Williams had carefully constructed a life that bore no resemblance to her childhood in Smoky Hollow. Her modest home in a Columbus suburb had large windows that let sunlight flood every corner, and most importantly, no basement, a non-negotiable requirement when she and Robert had purchased the property 3 years earlier. The war had transformed Ohio. Factories dotted the landscape where farms once stood, their smokestacks visible from Clara's kitchen window. She found comfort in the anonymity of suburban life, where neighbors knew little of each other's histories. No one here questioned why she refused to enter the Williams storage cellar, or why she insisted on nightlights in every room of the house. "Mom, can I go to Betty's house after school?" her daughter Elaine asked over breakfast, 11 years old and blissfully unaware of the shadows that haunted her mother. Clara's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "Who will be home? Her parents?" "Just her mom," Elaine sighed. Already familiar with the interrogation that accompanied every social invitation, Robert Williams glanced at his wife over his newspaper, recognizing the familiar tension in her shoulders. "I can pick her up at 5, he offered, his voice gentle. After 12 years of marriage, he had learned to navigate Clara's anxieties without fully understanding their source. Clara nodded, forcing a smile. "Be home before dark," she added unnecessarily. She always insisted her children return before sunset, as if darkness itself carried danger. Later, as she hung laundry in the backyard, Clara watched her youngest son playing with neighborhood children. Her eyes never left him, scanning constantly for threats invisible to anyone else. When he stumbled and scraped his knee, she was at his side before his cry had fully formed, checking him with trembling hands that betrayed her panic. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, Clara checked the locks 3 times. The routine never varied: windows secured, doors bolted, closets inspected. Only then could she attempt sleep, though it rarely came easily. In her dreams, the mist of Smoky Hollow still curled around her ankles, and her father's heavy footsteps still echoed on wooden floors. Sometimes she woke convinced she had heard her mother's voice calling from somewhere beneath the house, though she knew intellectually, at least, that no such space existed here. Clara had created a life of bright normalcy for her children. Yet she remained forever poised for disaster, perpetually vigilant against dangers she could never fully articulate. The war had changed America, but Clara's private war had never ended. The summer of 1954 brought a new chapter to the abandoned Hensley property. Ruth Simmons and her husband Thomas, both schoolteachers from Charleston, had been searching for a quiet place away from the city. When they discovered the old farmhouse in Smoky Hollow selling for a pittance, they didn't hesitate. "It needs work, but think of the potential," Ruth had said, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. The realtor had been suspiciously eager to close the deal, mentioning only in passing that the property had been vacant for some time. Thomas saw only opportunity in the weathered clapboards and sagging porch. "We can fix it up over summers," he assured her, already planning where his workshop would go. Neither of them knew they were purchasing more than just a neglected farmhouse. The locals watched the couple with guarded interest. At the general store, conversations would halt when Ruth entered, resuming in hushed tones after she left. When she mentioned the Hensley name, the storekeeper simply mumbled something about city folks stirring up old business. 3 weeks into renovations, Ruth ventured into the cellar for the first time. The space felt unnaturally cold, despite the July heat above. Thomas had reinforced the stairs, but hadn't yet installed proper lighting, forcing her to navigate by flashlight. "Just checking for any salvageable shelving," she called up to her husband. The beam of light caught something behind a rotting wooden shelf, a small rectangular shape wedged into a gap in the stone foundation. Ruth worked it free, her fingers coming away damp with decay. It was a leather-bound diary, its pages warped with moisture, but largely intact. That evening, while Thomas discussed paint colors with a contractor, the schoolteacher sat at their temporary kitchen table and carefully separated the fragile pages. The handwriting was tight and desperate, the ink faded but legible. "December 9th, 1912, read the first entry. "He watches me constantly now." Ruth's hands trembled as she continued reading. Margaret Hensley's words spilled across the pages. Her fear of Caleb, her desperate plans to escape with Samuel and little Clara, the strange tonic her husband forced her to drink when she became difficult. "I must be careful," one entry read. "Samuel tried to warn Mrs. Whitaker, but Caleb found out. The boy's back still bears the marks of his father's belt." By midnight, Ruth had reached the final entry, dated February 3rd, 1913. "I've hidden money in Clara's doll. Tomorrow, when he takes Samuel to market, we'll run. Eleanor will help us if we can reach Morgantown." The entry ended abruptly with 2 chilling words: "He knows." Ruth closed the diary, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. She wasn't just renovating a house, she was unearthing a grave. Ruth Simmons sat at her kitchen table, the leather-bound diary spread before her, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Her hands trembled as she turned each page, Margaret Hensley's desperate handwriting growing more frantic with each entry. The schoolteacher had expected to find household accounts or perhaps recipes, not this chronicle of terror. "April 9th, Ruth read aloud to the empty room. "Caleb brought another bottle of tonic today. Says it will calm my nerves. It makes my thoughts foggy, my limbs heavy. I pretended to drink it, but spat it into my handkerchief when he turned away." The diary detailed a pattern of control that had tightened around Margaret like a noose. Caleb monitored her conversations, isolated her from Eleanor, and punished perceived disobedience with cold silence that could last for weeks. Most disturbing were Margaret's plans to escape. "I've saved $3.42, one entry read. "When the spring thaw comes, I'll take Samuel and Clara to my sister's. Eleanor will help us start anew." Ruth's heart sank when she reached the final pages. Margaret had packed a small bag and hidden it in the orchard. She'd written a letter to Eleanor explaining everything. But the last entry ended abruptly. "Footsteps on the stairs. The children are asleep. He knows." The next morning, Ruth drove to the sheriff's office in town. Sheriff Wilson, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and 30 years on the job, leafed through the diary with obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Simmons," he said finally, pushing the book back across his desk. "These are just old ghost stories. That farm's been empty for years." People have always whispered about the Hensleys. "But this is evidence," Ruth insisted. "A woman disappeared, and her own words suggest foul play." The sheriff shook his head. "That family moved to Ohio 40 years ago. Even if there was something to this, which I doubt, the statute of limitations has long passed." Frustrated but undeterred, Ruth left the station clutching the diary. The lawman's dismissal only strengthened her resolve. That afternoon, she telephoned the Charleston Gazette, speaking to a young reporter who seemed genuinely interested in the story. Next, Ruth visited the county records office, searching for any information about Eleanor Grant. Through marriage records and property deeds, she discovered that Eleanor's daughter, Patricia Winters, still lived in Morgantown. That evening, Ruth composed a careful letter to Patricia, explaining her discovery and including several photocopied pages from the diary. She also made copies of everything, storing them in her classroom at school, a precaution that felt necessary, though she couldn't explain why. "I won't let them silence you again, Margaret," Ruth whispered as she sealed the envelope. Not this time. The county sheriff's department arrived at the old Hensley property on a crisp autumn morning in 1954. Ruth Simmons stood on the porch, clutching Eleanor Grant's weathered dossier in one hand and Margaret's diary in the other. After weeks of persistent phone calls and visits to the station, her evidence had finally compelled action. "We'll need to tear up the entire cellar floor," announced Sheriff Wilson, his voice grave as he surveyed the space below. The cellar Caleb had built with such secrecy decades earlier now stood as a silent witness, its walls damp with age and secrets. The excavation team worked methodically, breaking through the packed earth with pickaxes and shovels. Ruth watched from the doorway, her teacher's patience tested by the grueling pace. The soil fought back, hardened by time and the weight of the house above. Warped boards creaked in protest as they were pried loose, revealing darker earth beneath. "This ground's been disturbed," muttered one of the deputies on the third day, pointing to a subtle change in soil composition. The team redoubled their efforts, digging with renewed purpose, but also a growing sense of dread. By noon on the fourth day, a deputy's shovel struck something that wasn't stone or soil. The team fell silent, the only sound the autumn wind whistling through the orchard outside. Carefully, they brushed away decades of dirt to reveal what everyone had feared: human remains. Beside the skeletal form lay shreds of fabric, preserved in the dry earth beneath the floorboards. Ruth recognized the pattern from a photograph in Eleanor's files, a dress Margaret had worn in a family portrait taken months before her disappearance. A simple gold band still encircled one finger bone, tarnished but unmistakable. The medical examiner confirmed what the evidence suggested. The remains belonged to Margaret Hensley. Fractures to the skull indicated blunt force trauma, telling the final chapter of her story. For 41 years, she had lain beneath the very house she had once maintained, her disappearance a mystery but had haunted 3 generations. News spread quickly through Smoky Hollow. Elderly residents who had known the Hensleys gathered at the general store, their faces drawn with the weight of collective guilt. They had suspected, some had even known, but none had spoken. As Margaret's remains were carefully removed from her makeshift grave, Ruth stood with Eleanor's niece, who had traveled from Morgantown upon hearing the news. Together, they watched as the truth, buried for over 4 decades beneath layers of soil and silence, was finally brought into the light. "She deserved better," whispered the niece, tears streaming down her weathered face. They all did. The discovery of Margaret Hensley's remains sent shockwaves through Smoky Hollow. News traveled fast in the small community. spreading from household to household like wildfire through the dry summer grass. At the First Baptist Church that Sunday, Reverend Michaels struggled to maintain his usual composure as he gazed upon faces that carried the weight of collective guilt. "We failed her," whispered Martha Jenkins to her husband as they sat in their usual pew. "We all heard those screams that winter. We called them coyotes." Her husband stared straight ahead, his weathered hands gripping the hymnal until his knuckles whitened. At the general store, old-timers who had lived in the hollow for generations gathered around the potbelly stove, their coffee growing cold as they pieced together memories long suppressed. Thomas Blackwell, who had been the Hensleys' nearest neighbor, finally admitted what he'd witnessed 4 decades earlier. "I saw Caleb digging at night," the elderly man confessed, his voice barely audible. "Told myself he was just putting in that root cellar he'd been talking about. But who digs in February when the ground's near frozen solid?" The other men nodded, their eyes fixed on the floorboards. Women who had once whispered about Margaret's nerves now recalled her bruised wrists at church socials, the way she flinched when Caleb entered a room. They remembered how Samuel would stand protectively near his sister Clara during Sunday school, his eyes constantly scanning for their father. "We chose not to see," said Mildred Atkins, who had taught piano to both Hensley children. "It was easier that way." The most damning revelation came 2 weeks after the excavation, when the current sheriff, James Wilson, discovered a locked drawer in his office containing his predecessor's personal notes. Sheriff Harold Donovan, who had served during Margaret's disappearance, had documented multiple complaints from Eleanor Grant and concerns from Mrs. Abernathy, the midwife. "Suspect foul play in the Hensley matter," Donovan had written in March of 1913. "But a man's home is his castle. Without evidence or a body, my hands are tied by law." The notes revealed he had driven by the property several times, but never approached the house directly. When these notes became public, the community's shame deepened. The case transformed from a tragic mystery into something more profound, a mirror reflecting their collective failure. Smoky Hollow had to confront not just one man's crime, but an entire community's complicity through silence. "This isn't just about Margaret anymore," Ruth Simmons told a reporter from the Charleston Gazette. "It's about what happens when we convince ourselves that looking away is the same as keeping peace." Her words would be quoted in newspapers across the state, forcing communities far beyond the Hollow to examine their own unspoken rules about privacy, intervention, and the true meaning of being a neighbor. The authorities located Clara Hensley Miller in a quiet Columbus suburb in 1954. At 46, her hair had prematurely grayed, and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke to the investigators in her modest living room. For decades, she had locked away memories of Smoky Hollow, building a life as a seamstress, wife, and mother of 3. But when the detective placed Margaret's recovered diary before her, the carefully constructed walls began to crumble. "I always knew," Clara whispered, her fingers hovering above the leather-bound journal without touching it. "Even when I couldn't remember, I knew." For the first time, she spoke publicly about the fragments that had haunted her dreams since childhood. She described her mother's growing fear in those final weeks, how Margaret would check the windows repeatedly, hiding small bundles of clothing and food throughout the house. Clara recalled being taught a game where her mother would whisper, "If Daddy gets angry, run to Mrs. Abernathy's house and don't look back." "The cellar was always forbidden," she continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. "After Mother vanished, Father would lock himself down there for hours. I remember the sound of digging late at night, and Samuel telling me to cover my ears with my pillow." The drawing she'd been forbidden to share became central to her testimony. Clara explained how Caleb had burned most of them, but she'd continued drawing in secret, hiding the papers between the floorboards beneath her bed. "I drew what I couldn't say," she explained. "Mother lying still, the shovel, the dark room underground. I didn't understand what I was drawing then, only that I needed to. Samuel Hensley, reluctantly contacted at his Michigan home, corroborated his sister's account after initial denials. His testimony came via telephone, his voice distant and hollow as he confirmed hearing their father threatening Margaret on multiple occasions. He told her nobody would miss her, Samuel stated flatly, said she was nothing without him, that nobody would believe her stories. Clara's testimony, combined with the physical evidence from the cellar and Samuel's reluctant confirmation, painted a chilling portrait of a family trapped in silence and a community unwilling to intervene. The psychological assessment that followed identified clear patterns of generational trauma. Clara's persistent fear of enclosed spaces, her hypervigilance with her own children, her inability to trust authority figures. The district attorney called her testimony the missing piece that brings 41 years of questions into focus. For Clara, however, speaking the truth brought not closure, but a strange, painful liberation. The burden of secrecy finally lifted, even as the weight of knowing settled permanently in its place. In the spring of 1976, 3 months after Clara Hensley Wilson's funeral, her children gathered at her modest Columbus home to sort through decades of accumulated belongings. Michael Wilson, her eldest son, discovered a weathered cardboard box tucked beneath stacks of photo albums in the attic. The box, secured with fraying twine, contained dozens of yellowed sketches, drawings Clara had created as a child. "Mom never showed these to anyone," Jennifer Wilson remarked, carefully spreading the fragile papers across the dining room table. The images were disturbing in their precision. A woman lying beneath an apple tree, dark hollows where her eyes should be, a cellar with a heavy door, a shovel propped against a wall, and most chillingly, a figure that appeared to be sleeping underground. What struck the siblings most was the methodical nature of the drawings. Though created by a child's hand, they possessed an unsettling chronology, as if documenting events rather than imagining them. Some sketches included dates in a child's unsteady script, corresponding exactly with the timeline of Margaret's final days in 1913. "I always knew Mom was haunted by something," Michael said, his voice breaking. "She'd never go into our basement, not once in 40 years. The family debated what to do with the disturbing collection. Eventually, Jennifer, a nurse at Ohio State University Medical Center, showed photographs of the sketches to Dr. Elaine Forrester, a forensic psychologist specializing in childhood trauma. "These aren't just drawings," Dr. Forrester explained after examining the originals. "They're testimony. Clara was documenting what she witnessed, or what she sensed, about her mother's disappearance." The psychologist was particularly interested in the repetitive elements, the consistent depiction of the cellar, the recurring image of the shovel, and the evolution of the drawings showing a figure first standing, then lying down, then underground. Children who witness trauma often process it through art when they lack the vocabulary to express it verbally, she noted. With the family's permission, Dr. Forrester compiled Clara's childhood drawings into a groundbreaking case study. The collection became a cornerstone in forensic psychology courses, demonstrating how children's artwork could serve as evidence when adult witnesses remained silent. "What's remarkable," Dr. Forrester later wrote in her published analysis, "is that these drawings predicted exactly where Margaret's remains would be found, decades before the actual discovery." Clara knew the truth all along, but in a community where silence was valued above justice, her testimony was dismissed as childish imagination. The drawings, carefully preserved and eventually donated to the university's archives, stood as Clara's enduring testimony, the voice she found when words failed her. In the autumn of 1976, James Whitfield was clearing out his grandfather's attic in preparation for selling the family home. His grandfather, Sheriff Thomas Whitfield, had passed away 3 months prior, leaving behind boxes of personal effects that spanned his 40-year career in law enforcement. Between fishing tackle and old campaign buttons, James discovered a worn leather notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Opening it revealed meticulous handwriting, detailed accounts of the Margaret Hensley case that had never made it into official reports. The notebook contained testimonies from neighbors who had heard screaming from the Hensley property, observations of bruises on Margaret's arms, and most damning of all, the sheriff's own suspicions about Caleb. Hensley's explanation doesn't add up, one entry read. Woman doesn't leave without taking a coat in February. No money missing from their account at the bank. Something ain't right, but without a body, my hands are tied. James brought the notebook to the current sheriff, who recognized its significance immediately. The pages revealed that Thomas had interviewed Mrs. Abernathy extensively, documenting her concerns about Margaret's fearful demeanor during her midwife visits. The sheriff had even noted Samuel's withdrawn behavior at school, as reported by Mrs. Whitaker. I asked the boy directly if he knew where his mama went, Thomas had written. He just stared at the floor. When I mentioned the cellar, he started shaking so bad I had to stop questioning. Most shocking was the final entry, dated just before the Hensleys left for Ohio. Caleb's selling up quick. Wanted to get a warrant to search that new cellar, but Judge Wilson says I need more than a hunch. By the time I convince him, the Hensleys will be gone. When the notebook became public knowledge, Smoky Hollow residents were forced to confront their collective failure. The truth had been circling among them all along, in whispered concerns at the general store, in Clara's disturbing artwork, in Eleanor's persistent questions. At the town hall, elderly residents who had known the Hensleys debated the community's responsibility. We all chose not to see, admitted Mildred Jenkins, now in her 80s. It was easier to believe she'd run off and face what that might mean for our own safety. The notebook became part of the permanent exhibit at the County Historical Society, alongside Clara's drawings and Eleanor's dossier, a testament to how silence enables violence, and how truth, though buried, eventually finds its way to the surface. The mist that gave Smoky Hollow its name took on new meaning after the discovery of Margaret Hensley's remains. What was once simply a weather pattern became, in the minds of locals, a physical manifestation of the community's collective guilt. The farmhouse, now abandoned and slowly reclaimed by nature, stood as a grim monument on the hillside. Though the cellar had been filled with concrete after the investigation concluded, people still avoided walking near that part of the property. Some wounds never fully heal, Eleanor Grant's niece told a documentary crew in the 1970s. This valley learned that silence can be as deadly as violence. The case transformed how the community understood itself. Children who grew up in Smoky Hollow after the discovery were raised with a different ethos, one that valued speaking up over keeping peace. The local church, once a bastion of privacy and discretion, now hosted support groups for domestic violence survivors. At West Virginia University, Professor Amelia Jenkins developed a course titled The Art of Trauma, Clara Hensley's Visual Testimony. Students analyzed the progression of Clara's childhood drawings, from the early sketches of Mama sleeping to the more detailed renderings of the cellar and shovel. The professor argued that Clara had been documenting evidence through the only means available to her as a child, her art. What makes the Hensley case so significant, Jenkins wrote in her syllabus, is not just the tragedy itself, but how it reveals the mechanisms of community complicity. Mrs. Whitaker saw the warning signs. The sheriff suspected. Neighbors heard. Yet for 41 years, Margaret remained buried beneath layers of social convention. The farmhouse itself became something of a reluctant landmark. Though no official marker commemorated the site, locals knew its significance. Ruth Simmons eventually sold the property, unable to live with the weight of what had happened there. Subsequent owners struggled with the legacy as well. The Wast family left after just 3 months, claiming they heard a woman crying in the walls. Most powerful was the impact on domestic violence awareness in rural communities. The diary Margaret left behind, her final desperate attempt to be heard, became required reading for social workers throughout Appalachia. Her words, preserved despite Caleb's attempts to silence her, ultimately spoke louder than his violence. The tragedy, as one local historian noted, is that Margaret's voice was there all along, in her diary, in her sister's concerns, in her daughter's drawings. The Hollow simply refused to listen until it was far too late. The Hensley legacy endured through generations, carried forward by Clara's grandchildren with a fierce determination to break the cycle of silence. Sarah and Michael Thornton, now in their 50s, had grown up hearing fragments of their grandmother's story, not as family gossip, but as sacred history. "Grandma Clara never wanted us to be afraid of the truth," Sarah explained to a packed auditorium at West Virginia University. Her presentation, Generational Echoes, the Margaret Hensley Case, had become an annual fixture in the criminal justice program. She taught us that silence is never protection, it's permission. The siblings established the Margaret Hensley Foundation, which funded research on domestic violence and trauma in rural communities. Their work transformed how law enforcement approached family violence cases throughout Appalachia. What began as a family's burden evolved into a movement that saved countless lives. The old Hensley farmhouse, long abandoned after Ruth Simmons passed away, was eventually purchased by the foundation. Rather than demolish this painful landmark, they transformed it into a memorial and education center. The cellar, once a grave, became an exhibition space where Clara's recovered drawings hung alongside excerpts from Margaret's diary and Eleanor's meticulous dossier. Visitors to Smoky Hollow, once drawn by the mist-shrouded beauty of the valley, now came to bear witness to a different kind of beauty: the resilience of truth against the erosion of time and denial. Local schools brought students to learn how communities could either perpetuate harm through silence or heal through acknowledgement. "My great-grandmother's story isn't unique," Michael often reminded visitors. "What makes it powerful is that it finally came to light. For every Margaret whose story we know, there are thousands still buried in silence." The mist still rolled through Smoky Hollow each morning, but it no longer concealed, it revealed. On anniversary days, when the community gathered to remember Margaret, paper lanterns floated through the fog like whispered confessions finally set free. Clara's youngest granddaughter, Emma, became a forensic psychologist specializing in childhood trauma. Her research on her grandmother's drawings helped establish new protocols for interviewing child witnesses. "These aren't just family artifacts," she explained. "They're evidence that children know and see more than we credit them for." In the cemetery where Margaret was finally laid to rest, decades after her murder, wildflowers grew in stubborn abundance. Her headstone, simple yet defiant, bore the words that had become the foundation's motto: "Truth cannot stay buried." The echo of Margaret's story continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the boundaries of Smoky Hollow, a testament that even the most determined silence cannot forever contain a voice that demands to be heard.